morning and welcome to this new session in our course on Living Traditions on Sanskrit at IIT Gandhinagar. Today we have the pleasure to welcome Dr. Vinayachandra from Bangalore, who has been very active in areas dealing with yoga systems of self-exploration, self-fulfillment, and basically the whole ancient Indian systems, which today would be going by the name of psychology. So self-exploration, if you prefer. And this is a very important area, not only in terms of Indian knowledge systems, but also where we feel and we can perceive the presence of Sanskrit through a varieties of ways, which Dr. Vinayachandra is going to convey today and tomorrow. So with these few words, I will not introduce him further. He has lectured in many institutions in India and across the world, and he has been active in many of these networks. But you can find his entire profile on our website, as usual, iks.itgn.ac.in. So with these few words, I'll invite Dr. Vinayachandra.
Namaste. Sabhaye Namaha, Sabhasadbhyo Namaha. It's indeed an honor to be here delivering these two lectures on the invitation of a dear mentor, Shri Michel Danino. In fact, most of us in our generation, we grew up reading your books, inspired by the work that you have been doing. And especially one of the books that made a lot of impact on me was The Invasion That Never Was. But I think that's one of the most interesting books that every student of India, every youth should read. And you have also come up with a school edition. I think that's where it's going to make a big impact, I think. So thank you once again for this invitation to present something that I'm very closely connected with. Both the fields, a lot of work that I have been doing for last 1.5 decades is on the area of convergence of Sanskrit, yoga, and psychology. So I'm so happy to bring those elements in this presentation. Before I start, maybe I can begin with this question. Some of you who are here, you can answer. Maybe some of those who are connected online can also share your feedback or comments in the chat section there. What is your understanding of yoga? It could be a one-liner, a one word that you want to speak. What is your understanding of yoga? Whatever it could mean to you, not about what you would have read, what you would have come across, but what does it mean to you? How do you perceive it? And as you come up with your responses, maybe I'd like to say that this would be a talk which would be covered or which would spread across both the sessions, today's session and tomorrow's session as well. So some of the things that we will be discussing today will make much more sense in the concluding part, and the concluding part would make an impact if you familiarize with certain things that we'll be discussing today. So in that way, they're mutually connected. So it's one story that continues over 2 days. So now, what do you understand by the term yoga?
Hello, sir. So my perception of yoga is a spiritual Indian way towards physical and mental health.
Okay, it's a way towards physical, mental, and spiritual health. Thank you. Please,
quick answers. There are actually quite a few definitions proposed. Journey towards oneness with everything. That is one.
Journey towards oneness of everything.
With everything.
With everything.
Another definition, stilling of the patterns of the mind.
Stilling of the patterns of the mind, quite technical. The description.
One more, sahaj. Sahaj.
Okay.
One more, sadhana for the Indic artist to connect with the macrocosm.
Okay. One more means of sadhana to connect with what one considers as a macrocosm. Okay.
Integration of mental, physical, and psychological health.
integration of physical, psychological, and mental health.
Physical and psychological health.
Yeah.
And the last we have is when everything around me becomes a part of myself in my experience, it means we are in yoga.
Okay. It's similar to one of the earlier definitions, that to be one with the macrocosm. So when you feel you have extended yourself to everything around, or everything around starts reflecting in your being, that's yoga. Wonderful. I have a great start with these definitions. So if you look into these definitions, again, from what you would have come across, what you would have experienced, what you have heard, read, or whatever it is, it's largely, if you have to put them together, these perhaps could be the broad categories of understanding of yoga that would be available. First thing, something that is very concrete, palpable. You can call it a low-hanging fruit, that is the practice of asana, right? That's how many people use the term also. In fact, sometimes it's interesting to note the usage of the terms yoga and meditation, as though yoga excludes meditation, right? So we'll not get into those discussions now, but yoga is, many people or most people consider it to be a practice, primarily a physical practice, which could be concerning with the bodily postures, that is asana, or it could also be the kind of work that you do with your breath. So the breath work, asana practice and breath work is one of the understandings of the term yoga. Second one, if you go a little further, people extend it also to the experience that follows the practice of asana or breath work. So what is that? Largely the calming down of the mind. Mind seems to be little relaxed. So the term is used also for relaxation. When it's more focused, it could also be for meditation. So you have asana practice, you have breath work, you have relaxation, then you have meditation. Then if you go further with your own practice, your own insights, then you will definitely arrive at a point to say that yoga is the state of equanimity of the mind, where mind is quite balanced, not getting pulled or pushed by the extremities of whatever you can call pain and pleasure or any other experience. So an equanimous state of mind, that is the deeper level of understanding of yoga. And if you go further and start exploring, you'll also say that is one of the 6 systems of philosophy, Indian philosophical systems. Those who are familiar with the technical terms, what it's called is Shad Darshana. Okay, the 6 philosophical systems. We'll look into some of them in a short while. Okay, and then if you go further, you will also say, of course, it could have an asana practice, it could have a meditation practice, it could be a relaxation practice, but largely, as few of you pointed out, it's a path of sadhana itself, which allows one towards a deeper experience. And the deeper experience could be, as some of you noted, it could be the sense of oneness, a sense of expansion, sense of belongingness with everything around. So all these are various facets of the deeper experience and exploration. So yoga is this umbrella term which can capture all these shades. It could mean all these, and it is beyond all this, right? You agree with me? Yeah. Now, I think it's beyond any discussion to say that yoga is a living tradition. I don't have to do anything, emphasize or overstate it, why or how yoga is a living tradition. You just need to open your eyes and see around, whether in India or even in abroad. In fact, sometimes I feel it's practiced with much more rigor abroad than in India. Okay, the kind of seriousness that some people bring into their practice is definitely much more than compared to what we see around here at times. Again, I don't want to get into any sort of comparison, but just to say about it. So, as an asana practice, as a relaxation practice, as a mind channelizing practice, that is meditation, yoga is quite popular. And again, there's a whole industry and business related to it, again, which is out of the scope of this discussion. At some point, it was estimated that nearly 50 or 5 millions of Americans are practicing yoga, and there are more than 10,000 registered practitioners across the world, and there are schools, yoga teacher training schools, whether in India or in Europe or in US, like spread across. And even if in India today, if you visit either in Kerala or Dharmashala or Mysore or some other niche areas, you will see that hundreds of people come in for this 1 month 200-hour teacher training program. There's a huge demand. People would have to sometimes wait for months together to get a slot in some schools. So I'm just trying to bring out how much it is in demand today. So that clearly makes a statement for itself that it is a living tradition as of now. There is no second thought about it. If that is the case, now let us just have a brief overview of where did it all start, what was the trajectories in which it moved, and where is that or how is that we have arrived to a state where we are today. And in that context, we will see how Sanskrit is doing in this whole journey, right? Okay, this would be the approach of this presentation. I can broadly classify this whole journey into 3 levels or 3 stages or 3 phases. Of course, there could be a lot of in-between intervening shades there, but just for our discussion purpose, I'm keeping it at 3 different phases. One is the ancient yoga, then the classical period, and then, of course, I can go on with the post-classical, but I'm just pushing it under the carpet and coming to modern and contemporary yoga. So these are the 3 phases through which we will quickly see a journey of the unfolding of yoga, and this perhaps would have happened more than 3 or 4 millennia, right? This is what we will be looking into. Now, if I have to ask you this question, what or how do you understand or derive the term yoga? If I have to begin with the term itself, how do I derive it? What is the modality through which I arrive at the meaning of the term yoga? Of course, all these are definitions, explanations, descriptions that we saw now. But this is the beauty of Sanskrit, that most of the words, almost all the words, bearing a very few words, you can break them up into its roots. From the roots, you can derive the terms. And the same thing is applicable quite well in yoga also. So anyone has any idea as to how you derive the word yoga? Wonderful. So there are 2 root dhatus, the seed sounds. One is yujir, yoge, that means to unite. And the other one, yuj samadhav. The second meaning is where you dissolve. Okay, so to unite and to dissolve. These are the 2 meanings that we will be looking into. Sometimes it might even appear that they are completely 2 different meanings. So one is to unite, another one. So I'm just using one of the easy meanings of the term yuj, which means samadhav. This could be to dissolve. It could be to arrive at a state of concentration. It could be what technically called as a state of ecstasis. Okay. And some people even have thought it's not a state which happens outside, it's a state that happens inside. Therefore, it could be called as enstasis, something, a deeper state, a deeper dissolution that happens within. So, yujir and yuj are the 2 root words through which I can derive the term yoga. Which exactly suits my purpose, we'll explore later. So, I depend heavily on the etymology, and it is Sanskrit language that equips me to go to the root and explore the meaning of the term, right? So this is where I start. But if I have to go back historically, in historical terms, where do I come across the usage of the term yoga for the first time? Or perhaps in one of the earliest sources, then I would fall upon two important texts or in two important places. One is Kathopanishad. Okay. Or if I have to use the transliteration form, so in the Kathopanishad, it's perhaps for the first time I come across this definition of tam yogamiti manyante sthiram indriya dharanam. It actually is describing a higher state. It says that when all the five sense organs along with the mind, they are quietened, that is the highest state. And that highest state is called yoga. Tam yogam iti manyante sthiram indriya dharanam. This is one of the first earliest definitions of yoga that we come across in the text Kathopanishad. There is a lot of debates that continuously happen around the dating of the Upanishads. Perhaps Dr. Danino would be in a much better position to give them the right dating, but largely it is understood it could be before first century or first millennia BCE. Okay, they provide the range for the Upanishads up to 500 BC, depending on which Upanishad at what point, but roughly one can say it could be the first millennia BC where most of the Upanishads seem to be have composed. Okay, this is one of the earliest definition. I also come across a very interesting definition, the other Upanishad, the Shvetashvatara. In the second chapter of the Shvetashvatara, it uses the term Yujevam Brahmapurvyam. In fact, it uses in the sense of to unite. Let us unite with the Brahman. So, like our ancestors did, let us invite with the highest. On walking on the path of our ancestors, let us unite with the highest. So, this is the other reference where it is used in the form of a verb, Yujevam Brahmapurvyam, that we come across in the second chapter, 5th verse of Shvetashvatara Upanishad. So these two are the earliest references that I can come across about the definitions of yoga in the sense that we use it even today, right? In the first sense, in the Kathopanishad, it is used as the quietening the mind where it comes to a sort of a stillness. In the second sense, it is in the sense of uniting with something higher, the smaller getting united with the higher. Okay, so it is in Shvetashvatara. Of course, there are many other places later as well when they get used, defined, or contextually described, but I will keep them out of my discussion for this session today. Moving further, the other two important definitions which actually qualify yoga and also in a way liberate them from any limited understanding is what we see in the Bhagavad Gita. Just look at it, like when I have to understand the concept of yoga, some of these texts are becoming imperative. I can't have a discussion without referring to some of these important texts. And largely these are Sanskrit texts. We'll summarize them later, but the next important text that I'll be looking into is from Bhagavad Gita. In the Gita, there is a lot of discussion that happens around yoga. And so interestingly there, each chapter is called as yoga, right? Including the first one. Does anyone know the name of the first chapter of the Gita? Wonderful. Arjuna Vishada Yoga. And if I have to translate that, what does it mean? What is Vishada? Sorrow or depression? So the yoga of Arjuna's depression. You might wonder, how can sorrow be depression? Sorry, how can sorrow or depression be yoga, right? But in fact, that acts as a prelude for the entire Gita to unfold. Had that experience not had happened, had Arjuna not went into such a state of depression, perhaps the entire Gita would not have been available for mankind. And there's a deeper psychology involved there. If you look at your own lives, the best moments which have come out, the greater moments that have come out of your life, perhaps was preceded by a dark period, a period of pain. In fact, in one place, Sri Aurobindo remarks, pain is the hand of God cultivating men to greatness. Okay, so it's actually this pain that pushes us beyond our comfort zone. If that pain does not occur, then we would be more happy in that comfort zone, and whatever we could have achieved, whatever could have been our potential, would never have come out. And this is true with our own lives. This is true with Arjuna as well, right? So even the first chapter there, which largely speaks, and for those who are familiar with the content, you should see the description there. Arjuna gives long sermons as to why he shouldn't be fighting. He takes his argument on ethical grounds. He takes his arguments on the grounds of his concerns for his family, kith and kin. Then he finally drops everything. He says, Gandivam sramsate hastat. The bow is falling down. Vepatuscha sharire me. My limbs, my hands and feet are trembling. I can't continue. I'm collapsing. He actually literally collapses by the end of the first chapter. This concludes the first chapter. And that offers a prelude from where the Gita teaching starts from the second chapter onwards. And each chapter, for example, the second one is called as Sankhya Yoga. Sankhya here is used in the term of Jnana or knowledge, right? So that is Jnana Yoga. The third chapter is called as Karma Yoga. In this way, each chapter is a yoga. You can understand the kind of importance that has been attached to the term and concept of yoga just by giving each chapter or calling each chapter the name yoga, right? It is no small thing. So that's why if you look at the end of every chapter, you can come across this kind of a description. Iti Shri Krishna Arjuna Samvade. In this manner, in the conversation between Arjuna and Shri Krishna, this chapter by this yoga is concluding. So this is the kind of description that you come across. So each chapter is yoga. And there in the second chapter, which is titled as Sankhya Yoga, Jnana Yoga, in verse number 48 and 50, you come across two important definitions of yoga. And what are they? In the 48th verse, it says, Samatvam Yoga Uchyate. The state of equanimity is yoga, right? Just see how the meaning of the term gets expanded exponentially here. Equanimity is yoga. It's not about asana practice. It's not about meditation. It's not about pranayama. It's not about doing some kind of circus. No. Anything that allows you to experience that state of equanimity is yoga. Both the practice as well as the experience becomes yoga by just this one definition. Samatvam Yoga Uchyate. Samatva is the quality of being sama. Sama is balance. Equanimous is yoga. And in the very next verse after 49, this is in 48, and verse number 50, he come across again one of the most interesting definitions which allows scope for one entire path of yoga. Okay, and what is that? Yoga karmasu kaushalam. Yoga is nothing but dexterity or skillfulness in action. Again, this is adding completely one more new dimension to the practice of yoga. So what does it mean here? Karmasu kaushalam, in just 3 words, yogaha karmasu kaushalam. You should also see how beautifully Sanskrit allows to have shorter statements, brief statements, but which are pregnant with meaning, which you can keep on explaining, you can extend to any length, right? What does it say? Yoga is skillfulness in action. What is skillfulness here? Of course, not just doing something to perfection, while that dimension could be there. It is much more here. It is doing an action in such a way that you are not bound by the consequences of that action. You are not limited by the consequences of that action is the definition here. And here it allows the scope whereby any action that you perform can be done in the way of yoga. As a student, you have some responsibilities. As a parent, as a spouse, or whatever your role and responsibility is in the life, doing all these actions in a particular manner will liberate you from the consequences of that action, which allows you to, or in terms of modern psychology or positive psychology, if I have to give a word that is close to it, we have a concept called as flourishing, okay, where you can pour your best into any action that you're doing without being limited by what follows that action. The moment you are conscious, mindful of what follows that action, then it affects the quality of your work. Therefore, flourishing is a state where you just can spontaneously throw yourself into that action, giving the best outcome. And that is what Karma Yoga points towards. Okay, so this definition, Yoga Karmasu Kaushalam, adds this one more new dimension, that yoga is not something that you do on the mat. Yoga is not something that you escape from the world and do it elsewhere, but whatever role and responsibility that you have in life, you can do it in such a manner that itself becomes yoga. So this is the second important definition that you come across in the Bhagavad Gita. There are other definitions too. Just I'll refer to one and then quickly proceed further. There's one more place where it says, Tam vidyat dukkha sanyoga viyogam yoga samnitam. Know that to be yoga, which separates you from suffering. Again, a beautiful definition. So what is yoga, or what should yoga do? Yoga should liberate you from any kind of pain and suffering. Okay, that is, and so in this manner, there's a lot of discussion that happens within the Gita, definitions of yoga, and you also saw that each chapter is called as yoga. And further, there are also major 4 approaches to yoga that get presented in the Gita. Which are they? One is Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge. We will be looking into them later, but I'm just quickly listing them here. The yoga of knowledge, that is Jnana Yoga. The yoga of bhakti, that is Bhakti Yoga. One chapter is fully dedicated for it, while the thoughts come across and all over the Gita, but 12th chapter is fully dedicated for it. And then you have Karma Yoga, the yoga of action. And then Dhyana Yoga, what later comes to be known as Raja Yoga. This is chapter number 6. Of course, these ideas get mixed all over, but there's at least one major chapter which delineates those ideas. This is the 6th chapter. And then there are partial references to the practice of asana, again in the 6th chapter itself. But here in the Gita, you come across these 4 streams of yoga: Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, and Dhyana Yoga or Raja Yoga. So it lays the seeds for what later gets expanded as major highways or pathways of yoga. So that is in the Gita. Of course, there's a lot of debate on the dates of Gita, but it is later to the Upanishadic period. Going further, we come across a period where a lot of reasoning or intellectual engagement started. That is what we call as the period of Darshana. This is the classical period, the Darshana period, where there were a lot of schools of philosophies that emerged, and each one had peculiar positioning on certain important things. I'll refer, but I'll not go to the discussion. Like each school would have its own ontology or metaphysics, each school would have its own epistemology, and each school would have its own ethics. So these were the three major areas where the schools took their positioning, and based on that, they were classified into 6 schools of orthodox philosophical systems and 3 other schools called as non-orthodox or unorthodox. Again, this term, usage of this term is problematic. I'll fall on the Sanskrit terminology again here to describe this emergence of the philosophical systems. So largely we see about 9 philosophical systems emerging at this period, and broadly put into Astika Darshana and Nastika Darshana. Okay. Is there a term that you can, or a part of the term that you can note as a difference between these two? Astika and Nastika. What does Astika probably mean? Which is the word that you recognize in Sanskrit there? Asti, something is yes, and Nasti means no or negating it, right? So broadly, these 9 philosophical systems are classified into Astika Darshana and Nastika Darshana, basis the presence of something or absence of something. And again, this is slightly dynamic. If you ask me, if I accept the presence of God, an entity called God, then again I can classify some into Astika and some into Nastika. If I accept the presence of the authority of the Veda, then I classify them into Astika or Nastika. Third basis is also acceptance of a self, which is on the path of a sadhana. If I accept it, some you can call them Astika and some you can call them Nastika. So in this way, this classification is slightly dynamic, but largely we use it in one sense, that is whether they accept the authority of the Vedas or not. Okay, if I take this as the basis, then 6 systems come here. Okay, 6 systems of philosophy come in the Astika section, and only 3 fall in the Nastika section. But if I were to take, just to give you an example here, if I were to take the presence of a self, an ethical self on the path of sadhana, then all the 8 systems go to Astika and only 1 will remain as Nastika. That is the Charuvaka. Okay, if you have heard these names, that is good. If not, don't worry about them. Okay, so at this period, this was roughly around 5th century, 5th century BC, where we see the emergence of these schools. Some schools emerged at that point. Some schools took a very concrete shape as a well-reasoned philosophical system. Okay, so this is what we see happening at this period, and the schools that we see them are Nyaya, Vaisheshika, so Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Sankhya, Yoga, Mimamsa, and Vedanta. These are the 6 philosophical systems that take a concrete shape at this period. And here you see what was a thought in the earlier texts and the tradition, it emerges to be one distinct school. This happens in the classical period. Okay, and as such, what you see, the trend in this period, each one of these schools would have one core text. around which that entire tradition starts to develop, right? And most of the texts of these traditions, they're called as sutra literature. I hope you would have come across this word sutra and the characteristics of a sutra in any of the earlier discussions, so don't want to go into the detail, but this again is one of the most beautiful ways of presenting an idea that you see across domains and disciplines happening in that period. Okay, sutra has some of these characters. One, it has to be very brief. It can't be long. They have to be short statements to the extent that you see in math, in Vyakarana, that is grammar, in the Panini Sutra, which could have been also composed more or less at the same time. The last sutra, there are about 3,984 sutras, and the last sutra is just two sounds. Okay, just this is the last sutra, just two sounds, and it actually has tremendous implications on set of few hundreds of sutras that precede before, right? So this is the way the sutra literature has been composed, and even to date, Professor Danino can correct me, I have not come across any other text like Panini's Sutra in any part of the world's literature. Such a brevity, such a lucid way of presentation, such a systematic organization of thought in 4 chapters, okay, spread across, I mean, totally you have about nearly, as I said, 4,000 sutras, but presented in such a systematic manner. So if you really have to see one of the genius of creation in Sanskrit, you'll have to look into Panini's Ashtadhyayi. Okay, it follows all the characteristics that are required for a sutra, while you can see them more or less in the other domains also. But here in the Panini's Ashtadhyayi, you can almost keep the checklist and see what characteristics it will fulfill, and it checks on all the boxes there. Okay, so coming here, so these sutras, one is it has to be brief or short in statement. Second, it has to be unambiguous, whatever it's stating. It should be asandigdham, alpaksharam, asandigdham, and then it should be saravat. It should have a universal, or it should be wider in its application. I cannot make a rule which is very short, okay, and applies to only a smaller area. No, when I make a rule, it should have a wider application, saravat, vishvato mukham, universal in its application, astobhyam and anavadyam, without any errors, and which has very vivid presentation. So these are the 6 characteristics of a sutra literature, and most of the core texts of this period have been written in the sutra. So I have a Nyaya Sutra, Vaisheshika Sutra is also there, Sankhya, we have lost it. Then Yoga Sutras are available, Mimamsa Sutra is available, Vedanta Sutra is available. So that forms the core text of that period, and later you can see commentaries, additional commentaries, and the whole lineage developing around this sutra literature. And again, I want to add that this is not just when the later or subsequent texts were written, don't ever imagine that there was no review of the earlier document. They were not just praising their ancestors. If you look at the text, like for example, there's something called as a particular genre of text called as Vartika. And what is the nature of the Vartika? It says Ukta Anukta Durukta Chintanam. So what does it do? It reviews the previous literature, keeping in mind these 3 things, to bring out what has been well said, Ukta, to also point towards Anukta, what has not been said, what has been left out in the earlier text, and also Durukta, if something wrong is stated in the previous text, even that is also brought out. So Ukta, Anukta, Durukta Chintanam is the nature of a Vartika text, and in most of these traditions, you have the Vartika literature, which in fact does a sort of a critical review of the earlier text, which is very much required for the development of knowledge. So it is not only reverential positioning that, okay, whatever my ancestors have said is great. No, there has been a very detailed critical review that has been happening from time to time as well. Okay. So coming back here, now you can see these 6 systems emerging. And again, a technical part, like these two, for whatever reasons, they come together. These two come together and these two come together, and they're called as twin systems. So I'll keep the first and the last twin system out and just focus on Sankhya and Yoga. As I said earlier, each philosophical system has three main elements: an ontology or metaphysics, then epistemology, and the ethics part. Okay. So how do they get into a twin system? They perhaps share some of these. For example, in the yoga does not bother itself much about the metaphysics. It says, please refer to Sankhya. It adds a footnote. I will not spend my much time on what is my ontology, what is my metaphysics. I just borrow it from Sankhya and I begin my part there. Even I will not be so much bothered about my epistemology also. Let all these philosophical discussion, debate, let it be handled by Sankhya. I am more concerned about the ethical, the sadhana aspect. Okay. So in that manner, if you see, it's a purely practical tradition. It's a practice-based tradition. And that becomes even more clear if you look into the Yoga Sutra text per se. Except for the it comprises 4 chapters. Except for the 4 chapters, the first 3 chapters deal only with the practical components. The philosophical foundations are discussed only in the 4th chapter. So making very clear statement that my domain is practice. While I appreciate all the philosophical debate and discussion that is taking place, but I will focus largely on what needs to be done. So that's the approach of yoga. Therefore, it leaves the first 2 components, largely the epistemology and ontology, to Sankhya. Therefore, for any student of yoga, it becomes imperative to be familiar with Sankhya philosophy. Unless one is familiar with the Sankhyan framework, then it is not easy to understand why yoga is saying something. Okay. The entire Yoga Sutra, if you have to study and understand, a basic understanding of the framework provided by Sankhya is of utmost necessity. So now, just see what is happening. As a student of yoga, my concern would be more towards my practice. But if I have to deepen my practice, I need to be familiar with the philosophy. If I have to be familiar with the yoga philosophy, I can't avoid Sankhya philosophy. Right? How it's drawing in elements. So now I'll have to look into what does that Sankhyan framework is. What is that? Sankhyan metaphysical positioning, basis which yoga is trying to show the path towards whatever you call it as liberation or whatever you'd like to call. So just to quickly take you through the Sankhyan framework at this point. Sankhya is a dualistic school. So what do I mean by it? In simple terms, it says that ultimately there are 2 independent realities. One is the Purusha and the other one is Prakriti. Purusha is the spiritual or non-material entity and Prakriti is the material entity. So you can roughly call it as one as consciousness and the other one was matter. Okay, both being grouped under the names as Purusha and Prakriti. So these 2 are independent realities and they have distinct characteristics. Purusha is many in number, Prakriti is already united into one. So a sense of unity has already been attained at the level of Prakriti and Purusha are many. And the simple philosophy is, for whatever reason, Purusha gets identified himself with the Prakriti. And because he gets identified, he carries on with all the sufferings. It's just to say, to give you an example, I go as a observer or someone who watches a movie, but I get so much entangled with the movie that I start identifying myself with the character sits there. So when the hero falls in love with the heroine, I start experiencing it. When the villain hits me, then I get beaten up. I feel the pain. I mean, to that level of entanglement happens, and therefore, Purusha, who is supposed to be outside the system, he starts experiencing all these pleasure and pain. So now, the whole work of yoga is to help him to get out of this entanglement or identification, false identification. So that is the path of yoga. Okay, I have just left a few steps out. So what Sankhya says is, there is Purusha and Prakriti concept. Because he identifies himself with the Prakriti, there are a lot of evolutes that come out. So there are about 24 different evolutes that follow. So it is called as a philosophy of numbers, but we will keep it outside here. It suffices to say that the entire suffering is happening because of this false identification. That is true even in our own personal lives also. We get entangled into some roles, we get entangled into some specific work that we are doing, that we start to experience the pain. The moment we are able to extricate from that position, then we are in a much better position to deal with that situation, right? So that's exactly the Sankhyan perspective. Okay. And then yoga says, now that you have identified the source of all the problem, let me come here to see how best to liberate the individual from this suffering. So then it laid out its detailed path. Okay. But just to summarize it in 4 steps, which is shared by the Buddhist tradition also. First one, there is suffering. Okay. So life is filled with misery or suffering. Second, there is a root cause for the suffering. So suffering is not accidental. It just did not happen like that. There is something that has happened earlier, basis which the suffering is being experienced now. So there is a root cause for this suffering. Then the third one, suffering is not permanent. Just because you're experiencing it doesn't mean you have to always stay with it. Okay. And fourth one, it's not just enough to say that you need not suffer. Okay. The philosophy should also provide for how do you overcome suffering, right? So that is the fourth one, the path to overcome suffering. Okay. Yoga also takes this approach. You can see it in the Buddhist also. It is called as Arya Satyas, the 4 great noble truths in the Buddhist tradition. Okay. There is suffering. There's a root cause for suffering. One can overcome suffering, and there is a path to overcome suffering. So this is the core of yoga philosophy, which is shared by other systems too, and more so the Buddhist tradition. Okay. And all these, the beauty here is, if you notice, even Sankhya begins with this statement that my purpose is to see how best an individual can overcome his suffering. So in that manner, it is not outwardly. While there are positions taken by some philosophers who say a lot of Indian philosophical systems are otherworldly in nature. No, actually their focus is how do I enable, how do I empower the individual to be in a state where he or she has outgrown the sufferings of their life. So this is the main purpose around which the whole philosophical systems emerge, and a very clear-cut position is taken by Sankhya and Yoga. So now look at the situation where we are in. For me to understand yoga, I had to go through some of these definitions, which are the important texts of the tradition. Then I need to be familiar with the philosophical systems, especially Sankhya, to even understand yoga. And there, now I come to the core text of yoga tradition, that is Yoga Sutra. Fine. Unless one has a fair acquaintance, I'm not saying about a deeper study, but even a fair acquaintance, it is very difficult to appreciate what actually yoga is all about. So now we'll have a quick glimpse into the Yoga Sutra text per se. Any questions so far? You're able to follow? Making sense? Okay. Now, I'll just give a brief introduction and leave it and take it from there tomorrow. This text, particular text, Yoga Sutra text, is believed to be again written by sage Patanjali, who might have lived around 5th century BC, okay? Who could have been a sort of a contemporary of Buddha and Mahavira, but we don't know much about his life. We don't know anything about his period. Much of it is some sort of inference that we do based on the usage of terminologies, based on cross references that are available. Okay. Otherwise, we don't have any specific pointers towards his period or anything about him as a person. Of course, there are a lot of interesting stories of the tradition, but apart from it, there's only one book, a small book called as Patanjali Charitam. But apart from that, we don't know much about him. So coming back to this text itself, I said it follows the genre of sutra literature. It has been composed with these statements, short statements, what you call as sutras, running up to around 196 sutras. So there are roughly 200 sutras, precisely 196, classified into 4 chapters. And in each one of these chapters, perhaps it's around 45 to 50 sutras. So roughly it comes to about 200 sutras all in all. The first chapter is called as Samadhipada, the chapter on Samadhi or a higher state of consciousness. The second chapter is called as Sadhanapada, the path of practice. The third chapter is called as Vibhutipada, the part or the quarter on special attainments. And the fourth one is called as Kaivalyapada, the part comprising the philosophy. Kaivalya refers to the Purusha concept that we discussed earlier in Sankhya, where Purusha gets disentangled from the Prakriti. So he goes to a bachelorhood status. From his married status, he is returning to bachelorhood status. That is Kaivalya, Kevala. Kevala means alone, by himself. So it's a liberated isolation, liberated solitude. So that is Kaivalya. So that is the name of the 4th chapter. You have Samadhipada, the first one, Sadhanapada, then you have Vibhutipada and Kaivalyapada. These are the 4 chapters of Yoga Sutra text. The interesting part of this text, and where it in a way differs from the other sutras also, is that the first sutra, it says Atha Yoga Anushasanam. Atha Yoga Anushasanam. It's a 3-worded sutra. If I have to just give you comparisons, in the Vedanta tradition, you have the first sutra as Athato Brahma Jignasa. Athato Brahma Jignasa in the Vedanta tradition. Similarly, in the Mimamsa, it says Dharma Jignasa. See here the usage of the words. In most of the other traditions, it is Jignasa. What does Jignasa mean? What does Jignasa mean? Curiosity to know more, right? So it largely responds to your intellectual needs. Okay, it tries to explain something, it tries to understand, it helps you to understand something. So elsewhere it is Jignasa, about your addressing your intellectual requirements, but here it says Yoga Anushasanam. It's a discipline of yoga. From this point onwards, the discipline of yoga commences. And what does discipline entail? What do you mean by discipline in this context? Or even in the generic sense, when we use a term discipline, you have to have a disciplined life. What does it mean? Something that you're practicing. It's not just for an intellectual engagement, right? It's not just to fulfill your cognitive needs. It's much more than that. How does it imply, or what kind of implications it will have on your life, day-to-day living, right? Anushasana. Athato, from this point onwards, the practice of yoga begins. The discipline of yoga commences. That means it has implications on your ways of being and behaving. It's not just addressing a certain intellectual curiosity that has aroused in your mind. It's much more than that, right? So that is the first sutra, Atha Yoga Anushasanam. First 4 sutras are good enough to give you an overview of the entire text. Okay, I don't even have to go to the details of each of the chapters and the contents there. In fact, the second sutra, it concludes the subject matter. Third and fourth is perhaps a little more explanation to that. But with that, it actually concludes whatever it needs to communicate. And rest is the matter of details. So what does the second sutra say? The second sutra says, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. So now I come to the Yoga Sutra text for the next definition, right? I saw the definition in the Upanishads. I saw the definition in the Gita. Now I'm coming to Yoga Sutra text, which is the text of yoga tradition, while the others add meaning and value to it. But if I have to point towards one text which will allow me to understand, have a deeper understanding of yoga, then it is Yoga Sutra. Okay, here the second sutra is the definition of yoga. Someone also referred to, when we asked this question initially, someone answered with this statement, yoga is nothing but slowing down or stopping the movements of the mind. Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Again, it's a 3-worded sutra. Yoga, Chitta Vritti is one word. Nirodha is the third word. Okay. Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Nirodha is stopping. It could mean slowing down and eventually stopping. Chitta Vritti. Chitta here refers to the mind, the entire mind stuff. Vritti is the movements of the mind. So yoga is nothing but slowing down and eventually stopping the movements of the mind. This is yoga. Nothing more, nothing less. Right? So what does yoga do? What is the function of yoga? It allows you to gain mastery over your mind. That's it. How does it do? It does by helping you gain control over the movements that happen in the mind. It's not even saying thoughts. See the beautiful terminology that has been used there. Vritti. Vritti means something that happens in circular manner, which keeps on coming. And if you introspect or reflect a little about your own minds, you can see most of these things, they happen in patterns and largely circular patterns. Some thoughts keep on coming. You not have foreseen it in your wildest imagination that you're in some place that you'll get a thought, but it happens. Something that has crossed your mind about a decade ago can suddenly pop up, right? All these things are possible. And you find yourself in a similar situation again and again. And you ask yourself, why me? Why is this happening to me again and again? Right? Something that comes back in circular motion. That is vritti. See how beautifully, like this is how Sanskrit allows you to use the right words in the right context. And vritti also, like if I go to the root of the term vritti, which the dhatu I can see it as a vru is also means to cover. Okay, something that covers up. See, these thoughts or emotions, they can cover up your awareness. They can cover up your knowledge. Right? It's not that sometimes you don't have flashes, but it's only rarely you get those flashes, but other times you seem to be we seem to have these layers of coverings over our own clarity. When a flash happens, it is not even coming from outside, right? Where is it coming from? From inside. That means it must have always been there. But why did it not occur all the while? It occurs once in a while because something has covered it up. So those layerings of the mind, see, just one word, vritti, allows you these possibilities, something that covers up your clarity, the layers that cover your mind, the movements, which includes your thoughts, your emotions, or whatever that follows. All those are various kinds of movements that happen there. Okay, and it also points towards a pattern. So all these are possible meanings of the term, one term, vritti. It's a wave, it's a movement, it's a pattern, it is a layering or a covering. Yoga is nothing but a way by which you can overcome all these things. You stop the movements of the mind, you slow down the movements of the mind. Does this definition make sense? If I have a white paper here, of course, the text is very small here, you may not be able to see, but imagine I have a larger sheet here and you could see the text. What allows you to read the text here? What facilitates your reading? Of course, the generic conditions, the presence of light, that is common. And assume you have a good sight. Okay. Leaving these generic conditions, what do you think here would allow you to read a text? The empty spaces in between, the white space behind, the space between the text. If I just remove the spacing between these words, will you be able to read them? No. It's the white space or the space in between which allows you to have a good understanding of what is coming. Similarly, if you have to understand this sutra, he is presenting a position where he says that, see, thoughts clutter the mind. And they just don't come in solitude. No, they come with all their family members. Okay. If you see some person entering, you just don't see that person entering there. You will remember an incident you might have had with him or her earlier. That might lead to something else. So the whole family members enter. They just don't come in singular nature, right? So then they get jumbled, they get mixed up. Therefore, the best way how you can actually understand anything is to create spaces in between. And how can you do that? By slowing down initially, and if possible, eventually to stop them. So imagine your mind like this hall with large space, and all your thoughts or movements entering from one door and exiting through the other. As long as it enters and exits, that is fine. But if you invite and provide hospitality to everyone who enters, serve them with tea and coffee, and allow them to sit here for a long time, then would you be able to manage this space? No. It gets completely crowded and you will be lost in that crowd. The same thing is what Patanjali is envisaging, that he says that if you need to have mastery over mind, then you need to have your mastery over the movements that happen in your mind. Mind is not a separate entity. Mind is just the flux that you see of various movements, whether it could be thoughts, it could be ideas, it could be imagination, it could be emotion, whatever. All these things are moving in the form of a flux. See if you can create spaces in between. And then eventually slow them down. And there are ways of doing them. Nirodha, stopping or slowing down of the movements of the mind, is yoga. Now, let me ask this question and then conclude for the day. So in short, it says, gaining mastery over your mind is yoga. Now tell me which of the master, okay, or one question before that. If you have to gain mastery over the mind, what are the things that you would require? At least one main thing that you would require to gain mastery. Or to give you an example, if you need to be one of the drivers for these Formula 1 cars, what is that you should know? One is driving, yeah. And second one, how do those cars operate? Where do you have a brake? Where do you have a clutch? If at all it's there. I mean, how do these cars function? Is a basic understanding that you'd require to be able to drive these cars, right? Similarly here, if you have to gain mastery over your mind, what is that you would require? You should have a good understanding of how the mind functions. What are the modes in which it operates, right? What are the ways of its functioning? All those things need to be understood. And this text deals with those elements. Okay, what happens at the surface level? What happens beneath it? What are the different modes in which your thoughts arise? Where will you be able to, in which level will you be able to deal with that thought in a more efficient manner? What in modern psychology we call it as depth psychology, right? So all these are the part of this particular text. Now tell me, if this text provides me with a deeper insight and understanding about the functionings of the mind, then what would you call that discipline as? What would be the modern discipline which allows us, or which intended to allow us to have the understanding of the mind? Psychology. So yoga in this context, seen specifically from Yoga Sutra text, is nothing but psychology, right? And therefore, in that context, it becomes an extremely important text for us to understand and see what yoga can offer, specifically, not as an alternative perspective of psychology, but going forward for humanity, things have to be integrative. We have a discipline of psychology. I need to see how best the insights from this text and the tradition can add value to the present understanding, and how can we go forward. I think in that context, Yoga Sutra text has much to offer. So with this, I'll conclude the present discussion, and we will take it from what we have discussed tomorrow from this point onwards. Thank you.